Ladies and gentlemen, when we think about the lives of those who operate at the frontier of technology and human innovation, there is often an almost mythic curiosity about their personal worlds. People wonder not just what they create, but how they love, how they relate, how they navigate intimacy. There's an underlying assumption that brilliance in the public sphere should be mirrored in the personal sphere, that transparency is synonymous with authenticity. Yet reality tells a different story, one rooted deeply in neurobiology, in cognitive psychology, and in the mechanics of human emotion. The decision to keep one's love life private is not merely a social choice or a whim of personal preference. It is, more often than not, an adaptive strategy, one that balances the complex interplay between public exposure and psychological stability. Our brains, as we know, are wired to respond intensely to social evaluation. The prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, reasoning, and long-term planning, works in tandem with the amygdala, the seat of emotional intensity and threat response. When one's personal relationships are under constant scrutiny, the amygdala triggers a heightened state of vigilance, releasing cortisol and other stress-related neurochemicals that, over time, impair cognitive function, emotional resilience, and even creativity. There are numerous examples in behavioral neuroscience demonstrating that social scrutiny affects not only stress levels, but also decision-making and risk-taking. In controlled studies, individuals subjected to persistent public evaluation experience diminished activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, an area critical for assessing personal values and moral judgments. This is precisely why some highly innovative minds, whose work demands unfiltered creativity and high-stakes decision-making, may instinctively shield their most intimate connections. Protecting the sanctity of a relationship is, in a sense, an exercise in cognitive preservation. But there is more than neurochemistry at play. Emotional intimacy is a fragile, dynamic system. The human brain thrives on predictability within relationships, on the subtle feedback loops of trust, vulnerability, and mutual understanding. When exposure enters the equation, especially exposure amplified by millions of eyes and opinions, these feedback loops are disrupted. Trust becomes conditional, vulnerability becomes performance. In such a landscape, even the simplest gestures of affection are distorted by external pressures. The neurobiological systems that govern attachment, oxytocin pathways, the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, respond optimally when the environment is stable and secure. Public intrusion destabilizes this environment, creating conditions in which love, paradoxically, can be neurochemically penalized. To understand this further, consider a real-world analogy from research in high-performance environments. Elite athletes, surgeons, or astronauts operate under extreme cognitive load and public expectation. Studies show that when their private lives are publicly scrutinized, performance metrics decline, error rates increase, and stress biomarkers surge. The brain prioritizes threat response over creative exploration or procedural precision. Applying this to intimate relationships, it becomes clear why some individuals at the apex of innovation may choose to compartmentalize their personal lives. It is not secrecy for its own sake. It is a methodical, almost scientific calculation to optimize both cognitive output and relational health. We often underestimate the cognitive cost of emotional exposure. Imagine the constant calculation involved. Every word, gesture, or public interaction with a partner is potentially magnified, interpreted, and reinterpreted through the lens of millions. The brain, ever the prediction engine, becomes overloaded, scanning for potential social threats. Dopamine circuits, which normally reward exploratory risk-taking and inventive thinking, are hijacked by vigilance and anticipatory anxiety. This is not conjecture. It is grounded in decades of neuropsychological research on social cognition and threat perception, the very systems that drive curiosity and problem-solving. The mesolimbic pathway, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the default mode network, are compromised under sustained public scrutiny. Moreover, consider the evolutionary perspective. Humans are wired to protect resources that are critical for survival: food, territory, and reproductive partnerships. While our societal structures have evolved, the underlying neural imperatives remain. Intimate relationships are not merely social constructs, they are, on a neurological level, protected resources. Public exposure, especially intense media scrutiny, represents a form of environmental instability. Just as animals in the wild conceal nesting sites or mating behaviors to reduce predation risk, highly scrutinized humans may conceal relationships to protect emotional and cognitive resources. This is an adaptive behavior encoded over millennia, now manifesting in a modern context where social visibility is almost inescapable. Yet, the story does not end with threat avoidance. There is a deeper principle at work, one of deliberate cognitive optimization. Innovation requires periods of intense focus, long stretches of uninterrupted thought, and emotional equilibrium. Personal relationships, when exposed, introduce variables outside of one's control, public commentary, unsolicited opinions, misinterpretations. Each of these variables is processed by the brain as a potential cognitive hazard. The prefrontal cortex, which coordinates executive function, is forced to allocate resources to managing social perception rather than exploring new conceptual frontiers. By protecting intimate relationships from public exposure, one essentially preserves a cognitive sanctuary, a domain where trust, vulnerability, and emotional stability can flourish without interference. Historical and contemporary examples across domains reinforce this principle. Consider leaders in science, technology, and the arts who have shielded their personal lives from the public gaze. Those who successfully maintain this separation often report higher creativity, enhanced focus, and more resilient emotional health. The common thread is not an aversion to sharing, but a strategic management of cognitive load and emotional energy. Neuroscience confirms that even small reductions in external stressors, such as invasive curiosity, can produce measurable enhancements in problem-solving ability, decision-making speed, and long-term mental health. There is also a fascinating intersection with the concept of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, broadly defined, is the ability to recognize, regulate, and optimize emotions in oneself and others. In the context of highly visible individuals, managing emotional intelligence is no small task. Every interaction becomes layered with metacognition. How will this be perceived? How might it affect the partner? How will it ripple through networks of perception and influence? By maintaining privacy, individuals preserve the raw, authentic channels of emotional exchange, where oxytocin, vasopressin, and dopamine can operate without contamination from external judgment. These neurochemicals, in turn, reinforce attachment satisfaction and cognitive clarity, creating a feedback loop that supports both relational and professional excellence. And let us not overlook the social dynamics at play. Publicly visible relationships introduce a form of social noise, unsolicited interpretations, speculation, and narrative imposition. Humans are remarkably sensitive to social evaluation. Mirror neuron systems, which help us simulate and predict others' intentions, are constantly active in these contexts. The mind becomes distracted by simulating not only the partner's responses, but also the imagined perceptions of observers. This diverts cognitive resources from creative or analytical tasks. In effect, privacy is a cognitive tool, a way to reduce unnecessary computational overhead and optimize the mental machinery for high-stakes innovation. This approach is not about avoidance or detachment. It is about stewardship of cognitive bandwidth, emotional stability, and relational integrity. When the mind is constantly monitoring public perception, it is effectively running multiple parallel simulations, predicting how each action might be interpreted, anticipating criticism, and recalibrating behavior in real time. Neuroimaging studies demonstrate that these predictive processes, while adaptive in moderation, become exhausting when prolonged or exaggerated. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, which manage error detection and conflict monitoring, are consistently active in such scenarios. Over time, this hyper-vigilance can blunt creativity, slow decision-making, and erode resilience. critical deficits for anyone engaged in pioneering work. It is also instructive to consider the impact on the relational partner. Human attachment systems are finely attuned to reciprocity, trust, and predictability. When relationships are publicized, these systems are exposed to irregularities and inconsistencies imposed by external pressures. Studies in attachment neuroscience indicate that unpredictability and social evaluation trigger heightened amygdala activity and dysregulate oxytocin signaling. In plain terms, love itself, the neurochemistry that allows humans to connect deeply, becomes harder to maintain in the spotlight. Protecting relationships from visibility is not a denial of intimacy. It is a conscious preservation of the neurochemical environment in which intimacy can thrive. Moreover, consider the role of narrative and memory. Humans are storytelling beings, constantly constructing coherent narratives to make sense of their experiences. When private relationships are exposed, external narratives often clash with internal realities. Cognitive dissonance arises not just in the public figure, but in the partner as well, as every interaction is filtered through imagined interpretations. The brain expends significant energy resolving this dissonance, drawing resources away from the very creative processes that drive innovation. By shielding intimacy, one reduces narrative interference, allowing the relationship to exist in its authentic temporal and emotional flow. There is also a temporal dimension to consider. Long-term innovation requires sustained focus over years, even decades. Relationships are similarly dynamic and evolve over time. Public scrutiny introduces short-term perturbations that can destabilize these temporal trajectories. Dopamine reward systems are particularly sensitive to novelty and social evaluation. Repeated exposure to external scrutiny can recalibrate reward thresholds, creating anxiety or dissatisfaction in both relational and creative domains. Preserving privacy allows these temporal trajectories to unfold organically, without distortion from external stimuli. At a practical level, consider how this strategy manifests in daily life. A simple walk in a park, a private conversation over dinner, or a moment of quiet reflection with a partner. These ordinary acts are neurobiologically restorative. They stimulate oxytocin release, decrease cortisol, and allow the prefrontal cortex to reset from complex cognitive demands. In highly public lives, even these small acts become fraught with potential observation, speculation, and intrusion. By compartmentalizing these experiences, one creates a sanctuary in which both love and cognition can flourish simultaneously. The science of attention also plays a critical role. Cognitive resources are finite. The attentional system cannot simultaneously focus on intricate technical problems and the complex social calculus imposed by public scrutiny. Research in cognitive neuroscience demonstrates that multitasking across high-stakes domains reduces working memory capacity, slows problem-solving speed, and increases error rates. Public relationships are, in essence, a constant high-stakes multitasking scenario. Privacy is a cognitive optimization strategy, allowing attention to remain allocated to the tasks and relationships that demand fidelity and presence. Interestingly, this behavior also aligns with principles observed in evolutionary psychology. Humans evolved in social groups where visibility could equate to vulnerability. For both personal relationships and resource acquisition, secrecy and discretion were adaptive strategies, enhancing survival by minimizing threats to reproductive and social bonds. Modern public life has amplified these dynamics exponentially. The pressures of global scrutiny are unlike anything our ancestral brains evolved to handle. The neural circuits that guided discretion in small communities now operate under conditions of extreme social visibility, making privacy not only rational but necessary for psychological equilibrium. Emotional regulation is yet another layer. High-functioning innovators often rely on stable, effective states to maintain long-term focus and creative insight. When personal relationships are exposed, the limbic system is repeatedly activated, generating stress responses that ripple through the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. Chronic activation leads to sustained cortisol release, impairing hippocampal function, reducing memory consolidation, and increasing emotional volatility. By keeping relationships private, one essentially safeguards effective homeostasis, creating an environment conducive to both emotional and cognitive performance. There is also a socio-cultural dimension that intersects with these neurobiological principles. In highly visible roles, societal expectations often impose normative judgments on private behavior. These judgments are interpreted by the brain as potential social threats, engaging threat detection networks even when no immediate danger exists. This is a form of social load, an invisible cognitive tax that, if unmanaged, can erode both personal well-being and professional capacity. Privacy reduces social load, allowing the neural systems responsible for reasoning, creativity, and emotional intelligence to operate unimpeded. Furthermore, the act of keeping one's personal life private can itself be empowering. Agency, the sense that one controls one's own environment and decisions, is a fundamental driver of motivation and psychological well-being. When every relational detail is publicly scrutinized, agency is compromised. The brain interprets this loss as a threat, activating stress circuits and reducing both resilience and intrinsic motivation. By exercising discretion, individuals reinforce their sense of agency, which in turn supports sustained focus, creativity, and emotional stability. It is also worth considering the mirror effect. The protective strategy does not only shield the individual but the partner as well. In high-stakes environments, partners are often exposed to secondary stress through social speculation, gossip, and intrusive commentary. Their cognitive and emotional systems are engaged in the same hyper-vigilant loops as the primary individual. Privacy, therefore, serves a dual function. It optimizes cognitive and emotional function for both members of the relationship, allowing the dyad to operate in synchrony rather than being pulled apart by external forces. Real-world analogies abound. Consider scientific researchers who work on complex problems in isolation. Those who guard their intellectual and personal domains report higher satisfaction, greater breakthrough discoveries, and more resilient emotional states. The pattern is consistent across domains, whether in technology, art, or leadership. Discretion in personal relationships correlates strongly with sustained high performance. This is not anecdotal. It is a predictable outcome when one applies the principles of cognitive load management, neurochemical optimization, and emotional regulation. As we think about this in practical terms, it becomes evident that privacy is not an avoidance of life, but a careful calibration of one's neurobiological and emotional environment. It is the recognition that love, like creativity, thrives under conditions of stability, trust, and uninterrupted attention. Just as one would optimize a workspace, a laboratory, or a neural network for maximal output, so too must one optimize the environment in which intimacy occurs. Exposure, while inevitable in some respects, must be managed strategically, with full awareness of its cognitive and emotional costs. Another layer worth exploring is the interplay between novelty and stability in both cognitive and emotional systems. Human brains are exquisitely sensitive to novelty. It activates dopaminergic circuits, driving curiosity, exploration, and learning. But novelty in the social domain, the constant fluctuation of public perception, speculation about personal relationships, and the unpredictable responses of millions of observers, is fundamentally different from novelty in a controlled experimental or creative setting. It introduces volatility, uncertainty, and stress. The prefrontal cortex must constantly weigh risk versus reward in these social simulations, and the amygdala responds with heightened vigilance. Over time, this chronic activation of threat circuits diminishes the brain's capacity to pursue deep, sustained inquiry. By preserving privacy, one mitigates these disruptions, creating a stable environment in which the brain's natural exploratory mechanisms can operate optimally. Equally important is the role of metacognition, the brain's capacity to reflect on its own thought processes. High-functioning individuals rely on metacognition to anticipate problems, devise innovative solutions, and self-regulate emotional responses. Public scrutiny of intimate relationships introduces a metacognitive burden that is often invisible. Every glance, message, or expression must be internally analyzed, not only for its immediate social meaning, but also for potential public interpretation. Neuroimaging studies show that sustained metacognitive load activates the anterior cingulate cortex and lateral prefrontal cortex extensively, which can fatigue executive control systems and reduce creative bandwidth. Privacy, in contrast, allows metacognition to focus on meaningful cognitive challenges rather than navigating an endless social minefield. There is also a fascinating dynamic in the way humans form associative networks of memory and emotion. Relationships, at their deepest, are stored not only in episodic memory, but also in emotional memory circuits involving the hippocampus and amygdala. These circuits are optimized when interactions are authentic, uninterrupted, and predictable. Public exposure fragments these circuits with additional, often irrelevant, contextual layers, imagined interpretations, media narratives, and third-party opinions. This cognitive noise can dilute emotional clarity, making it harder for the brain to encode relational experiences as cohesive, positive memories. Preserving privacy allows the mind to consolidate these experiences cleanly, reinforcing attachment, trust, and emotional resilience. It is also worth noting the physiological impact of sustained exposure. Studies in psychoneuroimmunology reveal that chronic social stress suppresses immune function, increases systemic inflammation, and elevates cortisol levels. Even small, repeated stressors, a critical comment, an intrusive question, an unexpected photograph, activate these pathways. Over years, this can erode physical health, energy, and overall cognitive capacity. By carefully managing exposure, individuals preserve not only relational and cognitive health, but also their physiological resilience. In this sense, privacy is not merely emotional or social, it is a fundamental component of holistic well-being. Consider, too, the ripple effect on decision-making. High-stakes innovators often face choices that carry enormous implications for technology, society, and human life. Decision-making under cognitive load is vulnerable to bias, fatigue, and stress-induced errors. Public scrutiny of personal relationships introduces a subtle but persistent cognitive tax, diverting attention and energy away from these critical judgments. The brain, while remarkably adaptable, has finite resources for executive function. Strategic privacy is therefore a mechanism to maximize decision-making capacity, allowing the mind to focus on the problems that truly matter without distraction from unnecessary social turbulence. From an ethical standpoint, there is also a principle of responsibility. Those who operate in positions of influence have the power to shape perceptions, narratives, and cultural norms. Publicizing intimate details invites not only observation but commentary, judgment, and misinterpretation. This external influence can subtly coerce behavior, eroding the authenticity of personal decisions. By keeping relationships private, individuals assert ethical autonomy over their own lives, protecting both themselves and those they care about from being manipulated by the cultural machinery of attention. Real-life analogies reinforce this principle. Consider the world of competitive research laboratories or high-stakes startups. Teams that operate under conditions of excessive surveillance, even well-meaning observation, often underperform compared to those with protected cognitive space. Creative breakthroughs require trust, uninterrupted collaboration, and an environment in which mistakes can occur safely. Private relationships function similarly. They are laboratories of emotional experimentation, requiring safety and discretion to optimize attachment, learning, and growth. Attachment neuroscience further illuminates the stakes. Secure attachment, characterized by trust, predictability, and mutual responsiveness, activates neural circuits that promote well-being, learning, and social resilience. Insecure or publicly scrutinized attachments, by contrast, engage stress circuits, trigger threat responses, and impair both cognitive and emotional function. Preserving privacy allows attachment systems to operate in their natural, secure state, producing optimal neurochemical balance and reinforcing both personal satisfaction and relational stability. It is important to recognize, too, that this approach is not about withdrawal from society or avoidance of vulnerability. Humans are inherently social creatures. The desire for connection is hardwired, What privacy allows is selective exposure, the ability to choose when, how, and with whom one engages emotionally. This selective curation is a form of cognitive hygiene, preserving attention and emotional energy for interactions that are meaningful and constructive, while minimizing exposure to unnecessary social interference. There is also a temporal benefit. Innovation and intimacy both unfold over long arcs. Emotional bonds deepen through repeated, authentic interaction. Creative insights emerge through sustained attention and iterative exploration. Public scrutiny compresses these timelines, introducing artificial pressures, performance anxiety, and accelerated judgment cycles. Privacy restores temporal integrity, allowing both love and innovation to develop at their natural pace, unhurried by external expectation. From a neurochemical perspective, the effects are profound. Oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins interact in a delicate dance to reinforce attachment, motivation, and satisfaction. Social scrutiny disrupts this dance, introducing stress, induced interference, and altering reward thresholds. Preserving intimacy from public exposure allows these neurochemical systems to operate optimally, producing both emotional fulfillment and cognitive clarity. It is, in essence, a form of neurobiological optimization applied to the domain of human relationships. Even culturally, this approach resonates. Human societies have long recognized the value of discretion in personal relationships. Ancient texts, philosophies, and social norms across civilizations emphasize the sanctity of private bonds, not as a tool of deception, but as a recognition of the fragility and importance of intimate connection. Modern neuroscience simply validates these age-old intuitions, demonstrating that privacy is not merely a social preference but a rational, biologically grounded strategy for human flourishing. Finally, consider the psychological freedom it enables. The mind, unburdened by the constant weight of public evaluation, can engage fully with both creative and emotional tasks. Anxiety is reduced, focus is enhanced, and resilience is strengthened. The brain can allocate resources to exploration, problem solving, and deep emotional connection rather than constantly running social simulations. In this sense, privacy is not an absence. It is a presence, the presence of optimal cognitive function, authentic emotional exchange, and sustained human potential. And so, when we examine the choice to protect one's personal relationships from public scrutiny, we see it as not a trivial or self-serving act. It is a deeply rational strategy, grounded in the principles of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and emotional regulation. It is a deliberate orchestration of one's mental and emotional environment, designed to maximize clarity, creativity, and relational depth. It is a recognition that love, like thought, cannot flourish under constant observation. It requires space, stability, and trust. Imagine for a moment the mind at work in complete freedom, unburdened by the weight of external judgment, able to navigate complex problems, explore uncharted ideas, and engage fully with another human being. This is not an abstract ideal, it is a neurobiologically realistic state, achievable through the careful protection of what is most intimate and precious. By cultivating this sanctuary, the mind operates at its highest potential, not only in innovation and intellect, but in the depth and authenticity of human connection. There is a subtle, profound lesson here for all of us. Privacy is not secrecy, it is a tool for preservation. It allows the intricate machinery of the brain to function without interference, protects the delicate chemistry of attachment, and sustains the temporal unfolding of love and discovery. Those who understand this instinctively know that the cost of exposure is far greater than any social gain, and that the true reward lies in the unobserved moments, the quiet conversations, the shared glances, the uninterrupted hours of thought. These are the crucibles in which both human brilliance and human intimacy are forged. And so, when you step back and consider the lives of those who operate at the highest levels of creativity, innovation, and societal influence, it becomes clear that the decision to preserve personal intimacy is an act of courage, discipline, and foresight. It is a recognition that the mind, like the heart, thrives best in an environment of safety and discretion. It is an acknowledgement that human flourishing, intellectual, emotional, and relational, is deeply interdependent, and that the careful curation of our inner lives is as vital as the public impact we aspire to achieve. In the end, this is a lesson for every one of us, regardless of our public visibility or professional domain. The quality of our relationships, the depth of our focus, and the clarity of our thought are intimately intertwined. Protecting what is private is not an act of isolation, but an investment in the full spectrum of human potential. It is a commitment to ensure that our love, our creativity, and our ideas can grow without the corrosive influence of constant observation. Ladies and gentlemen, let us remember that brilliance and love alike require sanctuaries, spaces where the mind can explore freely, where the heart can open safely, and where human connection can thrive on its own terms. In honoring these sanctuaries, we honor not only those we love, but also the boundless capacities of the human mind. And it is in these hidden, sacred spaces that the greatest insights, the deepest connections, and the most transformative innovations are born. Thank you.